The editor is document-based, meaning that every single asset that's used by the editor is represented as a separate tab with its own 3D preview and properties and so on. So for instance, if I open this barrel here, then I get this tab, a 3D preview, and all of the properties that describe how the asset actually gets created. And the advantage of this is that the document on disk, so the barrel mesh asset here, describes how the asset is created. And in some cases, or in many cases, you would say that the object is read from some file. But for example, in this case, we actually create the data procedurally. So I can just quickly change this and have a completely different form. And there is no file on disk that represents this asset actually. So I'm a little bit more decoupled from the files that I actually use, which means I can reuse the same files for multiple assets in different settings. So I could reuse, for example, the same texture asset, texture file as the alpha channel for multiple other textures. Or I could reuse a texture and sometimes use it as a texture or as a height map and so on. And the engine doesn't dictate which file formats I use for which use case. So in the asset browser you see all of the different types, and every type has its own custom way of previewing things. If you want to work on something, let's say I actually want to figure out how my model looks best in the world, then it is easiest to move this one to a separate container window. So I can now have this on a second screen, and then I can modify the data here and transform the asset, and then I will see the result here as well. And this way I can work, for example, on a particle effect in the editor, in the particle editor, and in my scene I can immediately see whether the sizes match and so on. So and I have separate undo redo stacks per document, so I can easily separate my work here and on the other side. I will now show how to import an asset. So the easiest way is to just use the import asset functionality. And I will now just check for a mesh. So I just import this OBJ file. And the system knows that OBJ files usually represent meshes, so it allows me to import this as a collision mesh and additionally as a render mesh. And I can even choose that it also is supposed to import all of the materials and textures that it needs. So now they are created. I open the two documents, and now this is the render mesh that I imported. And so far it will only show this missing mesh box because the actual data has not been transformed yet. All that it did was it created this document and it set up that this is the input file and some other settings that it could auto-detect. Similarly for the collision mesh, again it specified that this is the input file, that it's supposed to be a triangle mesh and so on. It didn't load the data yet, but I can already use it. So if I search for this, it will already appear here, and I know that the mesh will be very large, so I can already scale it down. And now from the perspective of the engine, the asset kind of already exists. It knows how to handle it because it's all GUID based. But when the engine actually tries to load the data is missing, so the engine does its default fallback, which is just replace it by some placeholder. And now I will actually just transform this mesh. What happens is that it now loaded the mesh. So this represents the triangle data, but it did also created the material assets and the texture assets that are needed, but they are not yet imported because I only transformed this one. So if I go back here, I now see that it's actually already in there. And now I can also look at the materials and see that they aren't done yet, and I can look at the textures that they are using, and of course they aren't imported yet. So I could manually transform all of them, something like this, then they are there. Or I could just say that the system should just transform all assets that it knows about that have to be updated. But those are blocking operations, so then the computer would do as much as it can, as fast as it can. Or I can just say, I want to do this in the background. So I press the play button here, and now I can continue using the editor, but in the background here, it will transform 7 assets which are currently not yet up to date, and will while I can continue working. So for this asset, it's actually relatively fast because it's not so much. But if you have an asset that has 100 textures or so, that can take quite a while, and you can continue working while doing so. Now I see that the textures for the trees and so on need an alpha mask. So here the material, I see that it needs to be transparent, so set it to masked, but no difference. That's because the mask mode needs an alpha channel, and the texture currently doesn't have an alpha channel. If I look at the texture, then this one here is just RGB. And now I can just easily say, hey, I know that the data on disk actually is separate. It is one RGB file and one mask file. So I choose this, get a second input, and I will just go there and select the mask file, transform the file, and now it has this alpha channel in here, which I can also have a look at. So now there it is. And in the material, we now see that the grayish background looks through. And here my trees are now properly rendered. Now I have the same thing with the grass in front. So I will just open that. Again, say that it's masked, and go to the texture. If I look here at the alpha channel now, it's just white. So again, select this texture, and there it is. So again, now my material looks properly, and now the mesh in here is rendered correctly.